So time to clown on the rest of the Warhammer 40k galaxy. Let's talk about the lightning-fast prismatic blur that is a Harlequin army in Warhammer 40k. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're venturing into the webway to take a look at the enigmatic Aeldari that are the Harlequins and talk about the brutal strength of these deadly performers on the battlefields of the 41st millennium. These enigmatic space elves are perhaps a fairly minor faction both in terms of the lore and in terms of the models available for 40k, but do seem to have a bit of a track record of being very strong on the table with some blisteringly powerful tricks and mobility options. In the video we'll talk through why the army is strong, look through some of the specific sections of the codex for some of their best rules, go through their unit pool, and finish up with a couple of different strong army lists for the faction. First up then, Harlequins have perhaps been one of the biggest winners of 40k 9th edition so far, and seem to be remaining so at time of recording. They started out the edition very nicely, vying with Space Marines for the top spots, got a little bit codex creeped as most of the other books came out, but when the new Codex Aeldari dropped, and Harlequins were a part of that, they really got such a massive tune-up that they became one of the strongest factions in the game again overnight. Massively powerful, fast and dangerous units with a few really crunchy, painful character combos. Since then, the army has suffered multiple nerfs, things like their luck dice getting toned down, a couple of points cost increases to things like Void Weavers, but despite this, they remain one of the very strongest armies in 40k, arguably the strongest if we're going by current win percentages. I believe they're sitting at around about a 59% win rate in Nephilim, and having taken home a clutch of Grand Tournament wins. For army strengths, they have ridiculous mobility almost as their signature move. Every one of their units can move very fast, advance and charge across the faction, and have other tricks. This basically means that they're great for objectives and outplaying the enemy army, maybe making some units useless because they outrange them, and then focusing a whole load of force altogether in one place to absolutely devastate one section of the board. As well as this, despite being relatively fragile Eldar on paper, they are surprisingly hard to kill for their toughness and saves. They get 4+ invul saves basically across the board, and have a whole load of mechanics for -1 to hits, or stopping you re-rolling hit rolls against them. Their luck re-rolls are pretty handy as well, particularly for bouncing things off 4+ invul saves, or just amping up a bit of damage. As for weaknesses, they do of course have a very limited unit roster if you aren't allying them to another faction like Eldar or Drukhari. It doesn't really seem to hold them back too much though, while the core troops remain strong. If you want to kill them, anything that deals an excessive amount of mortal wounds or loads of low AP volume fire is likely the way to go. And I would say that while they do have okay damage profiles, I'd say it's merely okay but not excessive. They do need to make the best use of their sneaky tricks to fight on their own terms and always have the opponents on the back foot. Nevertheless though, an incredibly powerful army in 9th edition, and they are a pretty fun and dynamic army to play with on the table, zipping the bikes and the Harlequin troops all over the place, and hitting hard with a bunch of sneaky tricks. So let's talk about the rules available to the Harlequins then. First up, for core rules, they have a few things that are common to quite a lot of units. Basically across the army, every single model has a 4+ invul save, whether it's an infantry or vehicle. This means that you always do have at least a fighting chance of models surviving things that they wouldn't normally be able to, and it does mean that high AP weapons just aren't going to have much value when you're fighting this faction. The infantry gets an expansion on that by also getting a -1 to hit in melee with the Harlequin's panoply, so they can be kind of annoying to kill in range, but perhaps even more so in melee. The panoply also allows them to move through enemy models as well, basically representing their flip belts dancing through enemy ranks, and this combined with their rising crescendo of fall back and charge and advance and charge means that once Harlequins get into your ranks, they're not really going to slow down or stop for anything. You can't lock them in combat via most normal means. The bikes effectively get all these rules as well, they just happen to have them move through things via the fly keyword rather than the flip belts, and they still get the -1 to hits built in on their datasheet. Basically, don't just try and tie the Harlequins up with anything, you're not really going to get very far besides potentially stopping them shooting, and they can even do that for a stratagem. Otherwise, on their bigger things, their bikes and vehicles, they also have mirage launchers as well. This one's a debuff, which means that you can't re-roll hits against them, and the vehicles also double down on that with a -1 to hit too. So most of the time, even something like a standard Space Marine will only be hitting these on a 4+, and no chance to re-roll it with Chapter Master re-rolls or anything like that. This combined with the 4+ invuls can make those annoying little jet bikes much harder to squash than they really should be on paper. The other big core rules mechanic that they have is the Luck of the Laughing God. This is the one that they get if they're fielding a pure army of Harlequins without any craft welders or Drukhari, and though it was toned down recently without you getting any free rerolls or anything, it's still quite a powerful mechanic. The way it works is that you basically gamble on how many dice you roll. If you roll them all and there's no doubles, then you get that many rerolls to use over the turn, but if there are any doubles, then you get none. Previously you got some extra ones, but that was removed in the balanced data slate. In general, the maths of this works out that you're usually better to roll either 2 or 3 of them. If you do either of these, then you average 1.66 dice per turn, and you'll just either get them more frequently in clumps of 2 or less frequently in clumps of 3. On the turns that you do get them, they can be really quite helpful. Perhaps the single most useful thing for them is re-rolling failed 4+ invul saves, which can be really big against high damage shots, or potentially re-rolling hit rolls or wound rolls with fusion pistols. That seems like another solid way of converting a lot of damage. Definitely adds a little bit of raw power to the army. Next up, let's go through the other rule sections for the Harlequins in Codex Aeldari and talk about some of the stronger stuff. For Warlord traits, the Harlequins only get 3 unique ones of their own, but they do have some usable ones from the Saedaths. Out of the generic 3, I do think that the Foot in the Future one is by far the most interesting. This one just gives you a ridiculous buff to a Warlord getting a very long charge. You get D3 plus 3 advances that you can still charge after, and also a fairly ridiculous plus 6 inches to your charge rolls. You can still only nominate things to be a target of a charge within 12 inches, but you've got a very high chance of making any charge within 12 inches. And potentially you could be going a lot further than that, allowing some crafty positioning all the way behind enemy lines if you wanted to. Perhaps the other interesting one is Favour of Segarak. You get to change a roll for the Warlord to a 6 after rolling it. It would help out for a little bit better, say, saving throws against enemy attacks, though even with this it doesn't really make the Toughness 3 Harlequin characters particularly durable. We'll get to the Saedath Warlord traits later, but I do think that quite a lot of the generic relics are actually quite interesting. Perhaps 2 of the best being the Segarak's Rose and the Laughing God's Eye. If you just want a very fighty troop master, then Segarak's Rose seems to be perhaps the best out of the fighty relics. This one's a Harlequin's Kiss that gives you strength +2, so strength 5, AP -2 and a flat damage of 3, and on top of that you also get to reroll wound rolls. That's a pretty great generalist all-rounder there. It even lets troop masters be somewhat threatening to things like vehicles and stuff, rather than just being fairly focused against anti-infantry. Another quite common pick in 9th edition is the Laughing God's Eye. This gives you a 6-inch aura of a 5+ save against mortal wounds, really quite a nice thing for Harlequins, as mortal wounds are one of the more efficient ways to kill them. It doesn't matter if you're -1 to hit, no re-rolls and have a 4+ invul, if you're just going to punch straight through it with a mortal wound anyway. Otherwise, from the main relic list, the Storage Sword is a rather good melee weapon as well. And we'll get to the Saedaths in a second, but I think both the Twilight Fang and the Ghoul Mask are both pretty cool. Next up, and sticking with the characters, we also have the Pivotal Rolls. These ones are points cost upgrades that make characters a little bit stronger, and I'd say that the vast majority of them are usable but not auto-include good. You do see a fair few of them crop up in competitive lists, but in general they seem to be fairly reasonable value for what you get for the points, but not so good that you take them every single time you take one of these HQs. For the Troop Master, I think maybe the 2 most usable ones are Queen of Hearts and Prince of Light. Queen of Hearts allows you to punch through enemy invul saves on a 5+. In general, I'd rate that one a bit higher if you've got a sword with AP -3 or better, as opposed to Segarak's Rose. Prince of Light just gives you a nice aura of +1 to charges, pretty handy for Harlequin troops, though again at 25 points you are paying a fairly hefty sum for it. I'd say that maybe the Death Jester in the Elite section has some of the best value ones, where I think that literally all 3 of them are pretty good. Rift Ghoul does seem to be a very common pick for 20 points. This one allows you to ignore cover and gives you a chance of mortal wounds on a 4+ each time you hit something. Not too bad if you are trying to snipe characters, seeing as they'd punch through things like invul saves and high saving throws. Otherwise, I do think that the other 2 work absolutely fine. Harvester of Torment gives you exploding 6s with a big 3 additional hits if you get one. You can no longer stack this one with the Warlord trait, unfortunately, but it's still a pretty reasonable increase in damage for the cost. Otherwise, Lord of Crystal Bones makes him into a bit more of an interesting utility piece. If you hit a unit, then they get -2 to their movement, so it could potentially keep them out of the fight a bit more. And also it gives you an easy access to cancelling Overwatch if it's meaningful. Say for example, if you were playing demons and they had some flamers, then having this could make the difference between making it into combat with them or getting barbecued. Otherwise, for the other 2, I think they're maybe a bit more niche. The Shadows here has Mirror Architect, which allows 1 core unit to counter 6 inches further away. Previously, when this was an aura and it could apply to quite a big chunk of the army, it did seem quite good. Now it's just the one unit, it seems a bit more underwhelming for 20 points, though again could certainly mess with some armies, particularly anything that's short ranged. For the Solitaire, perhaps Thirsting Darkness might be one of the better ones, 20 points for auto-advancing 6 inches, and better pile-ins and consolidates. Just an extra little thing to help get that very scary melee to exactly where it needs to be. He is already very decently fast already though, so just doubling down on that might almost get to the point where it's overkill. Next up for Psychic Powers, and the Harlequins' Phantasmancy discipline really is a very strong one indeed. I think you could make really good arguments for 5 out of the 6 powers. I feel like Veil of Tears is generally going to be just a bit situational. First up, and perhaps one of the easiest picks, is Mirror of Minds. It's a Witchfire that does D3 mortal wounds to one target. Then after that you roll off against your opponent, and if you score the same or higher you deal an extra mortal wound, and then keep on doing so until you've scored 6 mortal wounds or your opponent beats you. Typically this would average around 3 or 4 mortal wounds, which is pretty awesome out of a single cast, particularly one that you can target against a character. Really quite nice to have around, and some people choose to run it on multiple Shadowseers for more chance of casting it. Otherwise, most of the rest of the discipline is good. Twilight Pathways can allow you to double move if you don't charge, can still be very good for getting troops around the table at double speed. Fog of Dreams is a defensive one, saying that you can't be shot unless your unit is the closest target. That one's potentially quite good for fragile troop squads holding home field objectives who have to sit out in the open. Webway Dance is a nice simple aura of a 6+ feel no pain, makes the core Harlequins army just that little bit tougher, and it's quite nice that this one works on things like Starweavers as well. You could potentially have that buff on really quite a lot of those little skimmer gunboats if you wanted. Finally there's Shards of Light. This one has the potential to put out an extra mortal wound or more if they're bigger squads or vehicles, and also doubles down on that with a -2 leadership debuff, which I think is meaningful enough so you might sometimes get squads fail rather than pass, and chase up those mortal wounds with a few more casualties that way. Overall it's a very good discipline. I'd certainly be tempted by Mirror of Minds. I do quite like Webway Dance as well, and any of the rest seem fine as well. Moving on, the Harlequins have access to really quite a lot of stratagems. They've got a couple of pages of their own, plus access to a bunch of the standard Aeldari ones. In general, the Harlequin stratagems do tend to be fairly strong, so it's usually worth having a fair few CP on standby for them. Plenty of standard Eldar tricks such as -1 to hit and fire and fade once per game. They've also got access to fall back and shoot if it's particularly meaningful for fusion pistols or neuro disruptors. A potential phantasm for a first turn redeploy if you find yourself hideously out of position, and then a fair few ones that can amp up troop damage, things like 3 CP to fight again, 2 CP for +1 damage, and all of the specific Harlequin weapons for extra mortal wounds or ignore invuls. There's also the rather punishing Saedaths Jest to re-engage an enemy infantry unit that just fell back within 6 inches. That could be really nasty if your opponent was hoping they might have been able to drop out of combat and they can't kill your troop in combat. There's a 1 CP one for infantry to heroically to intervene 6 inches, always nice to have and stop the enemy from getting too close, and a 1 CP one to re-embark in a transport after you've done killing something, potentially quite a nice way to keep a troop safe, and maybe even when they disembark they might be a bit safer hiding behind terrain or something. There really are a whole ton of good options. It is going to lead to some tough decisions as to which one of these you choose to go for. There's plenty of situations that could land you really big things like units surviving that otherwise wouldn't have, or potentially getting entire extra fight phases that you otherwise wouldn't have been able to get. For the Harlequins' unique secondary objectives in Nephilim, perhaps the best out of any of them might be a Deadly Performance. This one's a no mercy one that seems to be almost auto-include good for the majority of Harlequins lists. You've got 4 things that you need to try and do each turn: flip more objectives to your side, get into the opponent's deployment zone with something, try and kill 2 enemy units when shooting, or potentially try and kill 3 enemy units in melee. I'd say on the majority of the turns with their great movement, you could usually manage to ping units into their deployment zone and flip an objective over. Both of those just seem very hard for your opponent to stop, and occasionally you might make the killing ones as well, particularly against armies with lots of units. Otherwise, Take Your Places revolves around taking extra objectives each turn. That one does kind of compete with engage on all fronts or behind enemy lines though, both of which are pretty easy ones for Harlequins to hoover up. And Weave Veil is an interesting psychic secondary that could be quite good for a Shadowseer. You do a psychic action near enemy units to veil them. You have to target different units for this, but it does seem like it's an interesting alternative to psychic interrogation if the enemy is a bit light on characters. Overall a pretty usable bunch of secondaries though. In general, Harlequins are going to be pretty strong with objectives with enormously fast moving units. Next up, we've got the three Saedaths for the Harlequins: Light, Twilight and Dark. I'd currently rank them in that order in terms of power. The one that's played by the vast majority of tournament lists tends to be Light still, even despite the nerf. Twilight next, which is a bit more of a brutal melee version of Harlequins, and then Dark I'd probably argue is now the weakest of the three, but not by much. Losing the fights in death thing was pretty brutal, and it was a really good reason to take it. First up, Light seems to be the one to go for if you're thinking about running around a whole load of troops with pistols in Starweavers. Hit rolls of 1 to 3 always fail at greater than 18 inches away, and that's really quite nice with Mirage launchers as well. Even very accurate things like Custodes aren't going to be able to hit the Harlequins very easily at all. You also always get to shoot as if you were stationary with all guns, even if you're advanced, and that means that you could be doing big 6-inch advances with those Starweavers, getting into pistol range, and then blazing away with a bunch of nasty shots. It is really quite nice on these Skyweavers and Voidweavers as well. As well as that, I think their stratagem is just really quite brutal as well. It's one command point for a unit to move away when it's charged, and potentially if that was the only unit that the opponent could charge, you might well have just saved the life of one Harlequin unit. That's really quite big for 1 CP, really quite a good swing if it does make that difference. Finally, their Warlord trait Player of Light is also usable, +1 strength, +1 attack, and a bigger heroic intervention. Quite a nice general increase in combat abilities, particularly combines well with something like Segarak's Rose. Otherwise, I'd probably rank Twilight as the next strongest. This one sacrifices the fast shooting for more brutal melee power. You get +1 attack in the first round of combat, plus longer pile-ins and consolidates, which are quite helpful for tagging things. It's really quite solid. Your standard Harlequin's usually going to be hitting with an extra 25% combat effectiveness. And I also think that all three of the other parts of the Saedath are usable. The Twilight Fang is a nasty combat weapon with more attacks per battle round. Player of Twilight allows you to farm CP if you're willing to gamble those lock rerolls, and they do have an extra melee stratagem for 1 command point for 6s to hit auto wounding in combat. That one could be very nice for allowing Harlequin troops to punch up against tough targets like vehicles. Finally, the Dark Saedath after the nerf now gives extra AP in melee, and when Harlequin models are killed in melee, they deal a mortal wound on a 4+, but they don't get to fight in death anymore. The AP boost is good, though it is a bit more relevant against certain armies than others, particularly things with Armour of Contempt. Otherwise, Player of the Dark is another quite good fighty Warlord trait. A 5+ to wound deals mortal wounds in melee, and that combos really nicely with the Rose. The Ghoul Mask gives you a nice psychic denial, plus an aura of cancel Obsec, always nice for objective shenanigans. And for 1 CP, these guys get to ignore Overwatch as well. Against some units with a couple of flamers or a lot of volume fire, Overwatch could be pretty devastating for Harlequin troops trying to get the jump on them. Overall, I would still say that Light is the best, but I think all three of them remain very usable, and it's quite nice that the Warlord traits, Stratagems and Relics are all pretty standout compared with the generic picks. Moving on, let's talk through the units in the Codex. There aren't that many, but certainly the single most important one are the Harlequin troops, usually found riding in Starweaver transports. The players are 13 points per model, and have a fairly fragile but quite hard-hitting stat line, usually 5 attacks at strength 3 with their Harlequin's blade at AP -1, though they can upgrade to a bunch of fancy kit, including the Caress, Kiss and Embrace, all of which are AP -2 and damage 2, and allow you a different flavour of mortal wound or ignore invulse stratagem. They're most often run in small units of 5, and often get upgraded to the pistols with Neurodisruptors or Fusion pistols for +5 points, either giving you surprisingly potent anti-tank punch or a chance for a mortal wound. Particularly in the Light Saedath, it means that you can do drive-bys shooting out of Starweavers, hitting them with 4 really quite dangerous pistol shots up close, plus the cannons from the Starweaver itself. Small units like this really are going to be the backbone of the army. They're expendable enough that you can ping them out onto objectives and then have them be an annoying threat to deal with. They can potentially all swarm together and then just mob one big target with some very scary pistol shots, and potentially even some mass charging if you want to. And the profile for the Starweaver is small enough that you can hide well behind terrain and not have the enemy catch up with you at all. Perhaps their biggest issues are mortal wounds and volume fire, which kill them fairly effectively, and their damage output isn't super spectacular, but at least most of the time with their insane movement and stratagem tricks, they should be getting the jump on the enemy rather than the other way around. I'd say bigger, more fleshed out troops aren't particularly unusable though. I'd maybe just think about perhaps 1 or 2 of them at most in an army though, and maybe make the best use of terrain to advance behind, as they just can't really afford to be exposed to enemy firepower. If you get hit by any sort of volume fire, you're going to lose far too many points worth of models. In general, I think that troops and Starweavers should typically be the backbone of most Harlequin army lists. Otherwise in the roster there's a few other big things: Skyweaver bikes and Voidweaver gunboats, plus the Webway Gate fortification. The Skyweaver bikes are 45 points base, mount 2 Harlequins, and can come in small and fairly expendable units of 2, potentially quite useful for jumping into the enemy deployment zone for things like their secondary objectives or behind enemy lines. These things just move ridiculously quickly, 22-inch advances, and can still charge, and potentially can still shoot in light as well. Wargear wise, you have to choose whether or not to upgrade them to the Zephyr Glaives to make them a range and melee threat, or just keep them cheap with the Star Bolus. I think there's arguments for both, to be honest. Having them fighting combat well is quite nice, but it does undermine them being a bit more of an expendable unit. Otherwise, on the underslung guns, I think that usually the Shuriken Cannon is going to be the more general purpose option. If you are expecting to see absolutely tons of vehicles in the meta though, and you know you're going to be running into loads of knights, then the Haywire Cannons are very usable too. I would say that they pay a slight premium for their speed though. Their damage and defense maybe just doesn't quite outcompete the troops in the Star Weavers, and they tend to be a bit more of a supporting role in lists rather than doing the heavy lifting as they did in days past. We already mentioned Star Weavers, but they are 95-point transports that pack 2 Shuriken Cannons, very fast and efficient, and really quite a nice target for luck rerolls to reroll those invul saves. Very nice and light for 22-inch movement with the advance and still shooting. These things can basically just swarm wherever they need to be on the board and kick out a fair bit of general purpose damage. Void Weavers were super undercosted when they came out, but Games Workshop slapped them all the way up to 130 points. They pack a couple of Shuriken Cannons and also usually the scary Prismatic Cannon, which I do think is better than the Haywire one. Again, they tend to be a bit more niche supporting units as opposed to main battle line ones following their points nerf. I think they still do remain usable though, and they are an interesting source of long range fire support for the Harlequins. Ideally they want to use their great speed to hover and just get line of sight on the things that they need to, while not being exposed to too much return fire. Potentially if you did want to go quite big on them, then a big unit could be an interesting choice for Fire and Fade, potentially jump them out, shoot something very hard, and then use 2 CP to hide them back behind terrain, though it is now a trick you can only do once per battle. Finally, the Harlequins do also have access to the Webway Gate fortification as well. An 18-point gateway that you can set up in the midfield that can't be destroyed, and it basically allows the Harlequins to get from strategic reserve into the middle of the battlefield, and guarantee that they're going to be a big threat on one point on the board. For Harlequins, I would rate it as usable, though pretty niche still. I don't see the majority of lists taking one of these with the massive movement that Harlequins have anyway. Unless you know that terrain's going to be super light, then most of the time you could just hide the boats behind the terrain and then jump out and deal your damage, rather than having to use the command point shenanigans to come in on the Webway Gate. Finally, for the small Harlequins roster, we have their 4 characters. In the HQ slot, both the Troop Masters and the Shadowseers are fortunately very good, as they're the only 2 choices that you can take. I think the Troop Master's best just used as a melee machine. Give him a fighty relic, maybe Segarax Rose, and put him in a Star Weaver alongside your other troops. He can hand out some rerolls as he goes in, and be a fast and annoying character that can mess up some enemy infantry. It's quite nice that they can also take a fusion pistol for 5 points as well, can give him a little bit of an anti-tank sting as well. Foot in the Future can give him a pretty enormous threat range as well, if he needs to pounce on something far away that's a bit vulnerable. The Shadowseer, as we mentioned, really is quite standout for that many good powers on the Phantasmancy discipline. You could certainly take 2 of them if you wanted. I'd be very tempted by Mirror of Mind somewhere, maybe Webway Dance somewhere in the core of the army. The other spells are all very usable indeed, and you could also be using one for Weave Veil or Psychic Interrogation, giving you other interesting secondary objectives to do. The Solitaire is the priciest character and is in the elite slot at 110 points. He's basically a very fast troop master with a quick movement built in, hurtling out 12 inches, and is best served beating up elite infantry with 8 attacks at strength 6, AP -3 and damage 2. One turn he can blitz for stupidly long movement, and he also gets an extra 2 attacks there, and he has a 3+ invul save to keep him a little bit safer than he might otherwise be. I don't think he's quite as auto-include as the Troop Master or the Shadowseer in the HQ slots, but having that kind of threat range and that kind of melee is really quite good, though even with his 3+ invul save, you still don't want him taking the brunt of an enemy shooting phase. Finally, the Death Jester is 70 points, a useful shooting and sniper unit who can hang out in Star Weavers alongside troops. If you really did want to go big down the sniper route, you could take multiple ones of these, but in general a lot of lists just tend to take just one. As we talked about with the pivotal roles earlier, I do think that literally any of those are pretty usable for the points, and he has got a rather nice mocking laughter stratagem too. which could be quite a nice way to guarantee that the enemy fails a morale test. It prevents insane bravery, and between his own gun and maybe the Shadowseer's shards of light, you could have the enemy testing on quite a low morale. So finally, putting things together, I thought we'd just take a look at a couple of strong competitive army lists. You don't really have to look too hard to find winning Harlequin lists in 9th edition, they have won an awful lot of events. This first one is a light list by Pedro Chavez, who used it to take first at the Games of Westeros. The list is made up of a battalion and a patrol of the light Saedath, 2 detachments basically just to spam out even more troops. Harlequins do have a rather simple roster of units, but this list takes that to an absolute maximum, literally just 3 characters, and then 9 identical troop units, all in Starweavers, and decked out with max pistols, 1 kiss and 1 embrace. It's really taking the principle of just 1 fast general purpose units, just doing everything for the army, ideally hiding as many of those Starweavers as possible turn 1, and then jumping forward onto objectives, with real options as to whether or not you want to play cagey, rush the enemy, or do a brutal counter-attack with a lot of focused units, all moving very fast and hitting it hard with close-range firepower. For the characters, there's a pair of Shadowseers, both of which take Mirror of Minds because apparently it's just that good. One of them has Webway Dance for the Feel No Pain, and one of them Twilight Pathways for the double move, and I guess they could be doing some psychic actions if they needed to. Finally, there's a Troop Master with Segarax Rose, Foot in the Future, and a Fusion Pistol. He could give you a very, very long charge threat if you needed it, plus even be able to shoot that Fusion Pistol with light even after he's advanced. Overall, I must admit, it's a simple but very intimidating list. You can bring down really quite a lot of Harlequin boats and still have them have a lot of threat on the table, and any heavy units really can't relax too much while there's a lot of fusion pistols jumping around, plus the potential for some decent melee out of most units, particularly with mortal wounds from some stratagems. Otherwise, for an example of a non-light list, here's one top Twilight army, and this one is by Daniel Olivas, who used it to take first at Smite Club Open. This one's a single battalion plus a fortification, and has a few different choices. It's a bit more character heavy, plus takes some Void Weavers too. In this one there's just the one Shadowseer, this one taking Mirror of Minds, Shards of Light, and the Laughing God's Eye for some mortal wound protection. 2 fighty combos with the Troop Masters, one of which has the Twilight Fang for the extra attacks, and one with Segarax Rose. The Twilight Fang one takes Player of Twilight for the command point farming, and Prince of Light for the extra boost to charges. There's then a Death Jester with Lord of Crystal Bones. I suppose cancelling Overwatch is pretty nice when you've got this many fragile units. And then a Solitaire for another fast moving melee character. He certainly looks pretty scary in combination with the Troop Masters. Then for the troops we have 5 units in Skyweavers, 3 of which have absolutely no upgrades at all. I guess they're going to be more expendable ones for objectives and things, though in Twilight they could still bully some light infantry. Then there's 2 with 1 Kiss and 1 Caress, no pistols but can still be at least fairly intimidating in combat, and they have access to the stratagems for some mortal wounds. Then there's a big troop unit, there's 11 Harlequins here with 3 Caresses, 2 Kisses, 1 Embrace, and then the full complement of pistols, 4 Neurodisruptors and 4 Fusion Pistols. I'm going to guess that these guys are going to be a unit that's earmarked to lurk in the webway in the gate, and then spring forward into almost guaranteed pistol range and then a combat if the opponent does try and take whatever objective it's parked next to. Finally, for a few more hovering threats, there's then 3 Void Weavers, each with the prismatic cannons, a little bit of flexible longer range fire support for the Harlequins. Generally useful to have a little bit of range firepower, seeing as most of the list is almost exclusively melee. Overall, it's a pretty fun looking list, a load of hard hitting melee Harlequins and a whole load of fighty characters, plus an interesting option with that webway gate and the big troop. So there we have it then, a bit of an overview of competitive Harlequins in 9th edition 40k. As always, let me know what your thoughts are on the faction, how have you been finding playing with or against them in game, and let me know if there's any other exciting combos or tactical ploys that I've missed in the video. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k stuff coming. I will generally try and post new 40k videos every single day, and there'll be plenty more mini faction summaries like this, and I'm sure we'll circle back to the Harlequins and Eldar in time. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the content on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and you can find that down in the video description. The channel's Patreons are the main reason that I can create so much content like this quite so regularly, so if you are enjoying quite a bit, then any support is enormously appreciated, as the channel's patrons are the main reason that I can keep these videos coming so often. I do try and give a few rewards to channel patrons, including seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, then the link is down in the video description. In any case, an enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.